And so, but firstly, just to thank everyone for coming this evening to this conversation, this really important conversation. There is a lot of talk happening just in our various different corners of the world about the vaccine, various decisions being made in many institutions, trying to figure out what are the right ways to care for ourselves, to care for others in this moment. And there's a lot of honest reticence on the hearts and minds of people. And so we wanted to create this space. Megan is a professional, medical professional who can give us really sound and detailed information about the COVID-19 virus, different developments around vaccines, where we currently stand. And then also myself, being a minister here, wanting to create space, really encouraging us to just have dialogue that is honest, that is genuine, because all of us might be coming to this conversation from various different places, or we know people in other places of the conversation. So the better equipped that we can be to empathize with others, to listen, to try to seek to understand, but to also be empowered by information is what we want to cultivate here in this space today. And so without any further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. Megan Kirksky, who is going to lead us in our presentation to get started.
Okay. Thank you, Pastor Darrell. I am going to do a little presentation, which I apologize to those of you who may have seen it before. It does have some updates, kind of up to the day updates on the vaccine and the variants since the last time I spoke with a middle congregation or a middle crowd. I'll try to go through it as quickly as possible so that we have time for discussion and questions, but I also want to try to cover all the bases since I think everyone's background is a little bit different. I am going to share my screen now. I can figure out how to use PowerPoint again. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID vaccines, considerations for today and the future, and just a little bit about my background from the standpoint of why you might consider anything that I have to say. I am a medical doctor. I am board certified in anesthesiology and critical care medicine, so I do intensive care unit work. I also have a Ph.D. in infection biology, a field which is often referred to as microbiology and immunology. I helped to run a COVID ICU at my hospital during the major surge in New York City in the spring of 2020. And I've been actively involved in COVID and COVID vaccine education for medical and non-medical audiences. And my goal is really just to share as much information as possible with people so that we can make informed decisions in a time of great stress and great uncertainty. To outline, I'm going to talk briefly about kind of living in an age of pandemics and how these vaccines were developed so quickly. I'll briefly talk about the impact of race on this conversation, how the vaccines work, how well they're working, safety and side effects, and some other considerations, what might be ahead. The age of pandemics is here. This is not something that's been at the forefront of most of our minds until recently, but there have been a lot of somewhat sensationalized scares, but some of them have been real major outbreaks that have caused problems around the world. Just going back to 1995, Newsweek cover about Ebola scare and what other viruses might be out there. In 2003, we were confronted with SARS. Most of these primarily affected people outside of our borders and were not as much of an immediate concern. In 2005, we were dealing with the avian flu threat. 2014, we had people coming back to the United States with Ebola who were helping with one of the largest, probably the largest outbreak of Ebola that we had seen in the world up until recently. In 2015, we were confronting MERS following on the heels of the Ebola outbreak. 2016, you may recall a lot in the news about the Zika virus and its effect on newborn babies. And in this context, those scientists and physicians who were working in these areas and epidemiologists knew it was very clear that it was just a matter of time before we would have a major global outbreak on the scale of what we're seeing now. And so over decades, these people have been developing technology for vaccines that would be easy to modify for whatever virus did cause the next big outbreak, and that would be easy to produce quickly and on a large scale in order to help address it. And two of the main platforms that were being developed were mRNA platforms and adenovirus platforms. The recent epidemics of MERS and SARS, those are both coronaviruses. And so that focused a lot of research on the potential for a major coronavirus outbreak. And so then, as we all know, by February of 2020, going into March, we started seeing the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus outbreak leading to COVID disease in the United States on a massive scale. It struck our city, New York City, kind of hardest and heaviest early on, and has since been a problem throughout the country and around the world. This graph was updated in August 25th, which is today. Total number of deaths recorded in the United States at this point is up to 631,000 people in this country who have died from COVID, and over 38 million cases overall. And we have this very disconcerting pattern. If you look early on, we didn't have much testing. So you see a very low peak here, but this was obviously a much higher peak. We just weren't able to test for the disease early on because we didn't have the technology available. Then we had that first summer bump that didn't affect New York City so much, but much of the rest of the country. And then the winter surge, which was pretty widespread. Things started to look good as the vaccines came into wider use, and then we're dealing with Delta now, another wave. So it seems like every time we start to catch a break, we hit another wave, and it's pretty discouraging, but all is not lost. I'm going to go back a little bit, just very quickly, how we develop these vaccines. The adenovirus vector vaccines are the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine that you'll hear about that was not approved in the United States, but is used in the UK. These were developed in the 1980s for gene therapy, and they were not successful in the field of gene therapy, but because they caused a large cellular immune response, they began to be developed for use as vaccines. So studies in HIV, TB, and malaria were, the early results were not so promising, but the first adenovirus vaccine was actually approved in 2019 for Ebola. And then the Johnson & Johnson AstraZeneca COVID vaccines were approved. The mRNA vaccines, the initial studies began in the early 1990s. So again, we've got about 30 years of research on mRNA as a vaccine vector. These vaccines are non-infectious. They don't integrate into human DNA. They don't alter the DNA of the host. They're very unstable, which is actually, it's good from the standpoint of it not staying in your body for very long, but it did present some barriers early on in development that had to be overcome. In 2005, they figured out how to tweak the mRNA slightly so that it would be stable long enough to be effective as a vaccine before it's broken down by the body. And animal experiments were very active, showed good efficacy and safety in a number of viruses, and human studies had been started with mRNA vaccines for Zika, rabies, influenza, and CMV before COVID came along. So these are not brand new vaccine platforms. Briefly talking about what race has got to do with it, I think most of us are pretty aware at this point. There's a much increased burden of COVID-19 in minority communities. There were higher exposures earlier on, leading to more infections. People had less choice about where they were going to work, whether they're going to be able to work from home, and more likely to have to use public transportation, more likely to live in population-dense areas or multi-generational households where exposures were higher, and that resulted in mortality rates 2 to 3 times higher than in other communities. On the side of vaccines, there are some a number of special concerns that people have across the board, but in minority communities, there has been a history of unethical experimentation in this country and abroad that's given some people concern. There's concern about whether different populations were adequately represented in clinical trials, or whether these vaccines are equally safe and effective in different groups. And then there, especially early on, were disparities in access to vaccine supplies that were affecting uptake in minority communities. This is a slide featuring Kizzmekia Corbett. She is one of the lead research scientists in developing the Mrna COVID vaccine. She's actually a Ph.D. who's doing research on coronavirus vaccines. She's also a graduate of my alma mater, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, from the Meyerhoff program. And she has actually been pretty visible since early on in the vaccine process, because she knew it was important to make it clear to people that people of color were deeply involved in this work and standing by it. On the vaccine trial side, it was also known that this needed to be a priority, and it's probably, as far as I know, it's kind of unique how thorough for the Pfizer vaccine and the Mrna vaccine they were in making sure to recruit diverse populations for the trials themselves to establish safety and efficacy in different groups. And this is just a graph, if you look on the left, summarizing the racial and ethnic distribution of participants in the Mrna trial. 20% are Hispanic or Latinx, 10% African American, 4% Asian, 3% other, and including good representation of Native American groups who were hit pretty hard in this pandemic early on. That said, where we are today, this is doses of vaccine administered per 100 people. So in well-resourced areas like Canada, the United States, we've given well over 1 dose of vaccine to every person in the country. But there are parts of the world where the percentage is less than 1%. And so we're in a very privileged position here of having access to this vaccine. And most of Europe, Canada are in a similar position. China has actually been very good at distributing their own vaccines that they've developed in their own country. In New York City, I'm sure everyone has seen in the news that there's a huge variation in the amount of vaccination regionally in this country. New York State has pretty good vaccine uptake, as does much of the Northeast, but New York City is lagging behind a little bit, even on the national level. And if you look borough by borough, areas like Brooklyn and the Bronx and Staten Island have much lower vaccine rates compared to Manhattan and Queens. And then if you break down vaccination in New York City by race and ethnicity, it's pretty stark differences here. For example, in Asian communities in the city, vaccination rates are about 83% fully vaccinated versus only 40% of Black New York City residents, and actually only 55% of white New York City residents. So this is a huge vulnerable population that still exists in the city. So how do these vaccines work? The mRNA vaccines, the coronavirus, as you've probably seen, it's like a sphere-shaped virus with a bunch of spiky proteins that are all over it. And these spike proteins are required for the virus to bind to a human cell, go into the cell and infect a person and cause symptoms or disease. Because we knew a lot about coronaviruses already, it didn't take long for researchers to get the RNA sequence. So that's the sequence of letters or nucleotides that make up the RNA that tells the virus how to make the spike protein. And you can take this RNA that tells the virus how to make the spike protein. It can also tell a human cell how to make the spike protein. So the researchers who've been working on these mRNA vaccine platforms knew they could package the mRNA into these little lipid spheres, these little fatty spheres, to protect the RNA long enough to be able to inject it into a person where the lipid spheres would bind to the lipid on the outside of the human cell, the fatty outside of the human cell. The RNA can go inside of the cell, tell the cell how to make these spike proteins. the immune system then recognizes the spike proteins as foreign. They said this isn't a normal human protein, and it'll make antibodies to attack those proteins or cells that are infected with the virus that makes those proteins. So you then get a big bump in your antibody levels when the actual coronavirus comes by and it's covered in these spike proteins. Your body says, oh, we know this one. It's got an arsenal of antibodies as well as immune cells that can go on the attack and clear it from your body quickly, preventing, if not preventing infection, at least preventing severe disease. The adenovirus vaccines are a little bit different. They use a virus called the adenovirus that does not cause disease. And they use that virus to bind to the cell to carry some DNA into the cell. It's not DNA that integrates into the human body, but it is DNA that can be translated into RNA, which the cell can then use to make as an instruction guide to make spike proteins. And from there, how it works is very similar to the mRNA vaccines. The difference is just how you get the mRNA into the cell. And finally, there are a few other vaccine platforms, but the one that I wanted to share information on is Novavax. And you may not have heard of this one, but it's one that's doing very well in clinical trials and may be approved in this country sometime in the not too distant future. And this is one where it's not RNA, it's a protein-based vaccine. So it's a little bit more similar in its platform to other vaccines that have been developed in the past and used widely. So it may feel a little bit more safe to some people for that reason, because the technology is less novel. But in this one, they use in vitro, in a lab, they use a virus to infect a moth cell, and the moth cell makes all of these little spike proteins. And then they purify the spike proteins and make these little spike protein balls that can be injected and elicit the same immune response as you would get if your cell was making the spike protein. So how well did these vaccines work? All of these vaccines were developed initially against the original coronavirus strain that was circulating early in 2020. Pfizer and Moderna were 94 to 95% effective in preventing symptomatic disease. Johnson & Johnson, slightly less effective, but still very effective, 72% in preventing moderate to severe disease and 85% effective in preventing severe disease. Now, the cutoff for what we'd consider to be a useful vaccine is about 50%. So these vaccines were performing way above the level that we reasonably could have hoped for in terms of being able to prevent infection with COVID. Novavax, it was similar to Pfizer and Moderna in its efficacy, about 96% effective in preventing infection. It was just a little bit slower to be developed because they did not have the partnerships that the Moderna NIH partnership, the Pfizer partnership, and the power of Johnson & Johnson. These are huge companies that were able to develop things a little more quickly and get through the regulatory process a little more quickly just because they had more resources. But Novavax is coming along at its own pace and having very good results. So how do they work for Delta? Because we're in a different world now than we were last spring. Pfizer and Moderna, this is CDC data that just came out today, suggests that they're about 66% effective in preventing infection with the Delta variant. So that's it's a pretty significant drop from those kind of stellar numbers that we started with, but still well above what we would consider to be a useful and effective vaccine. And depending on what study you look at and what country, seems to be about 60 to 80% effective in preventing symptomatic infections. Still extremely effective in preventing hospitalizations and death in the 90 to 95% range for efficacy. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine seems to be about 71% effective in preventing hospitalization, and again, 96% effective in preventing death from the Delta variant. And the Novavax vaccine that recently, because they're a little further behind, they've been able to test against all of the circulating variants that are around now. And it's actually been consistently about 90% effective in preventing infection from any of these variants in their preliminary data. On the question of booster shots, Where are we there? So there are a number of people whose immune systems are weakened for various reasons, and they don't mount a good immune response. So their body never makes a lot of antibodies, or their cellular immune response is not very strong when they encounter a virus or a vaccine. And so these people who don't ever mount a good response to the vaccine, it has been shown that if you give a third shot of one of the mRNA vaccines, and now it's also looking like a second shot of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, you can boost up their protection to levels that are more similar to someone who had an intact immune response. So all signals point towards booster shots being a useful thing for people who are immune compromised in some way. There's also data coming largely out of Israel, which was one of the first countries to have almost saturation level immunization of their population. And they started with older people. So they have a lot of elderly people in their population who were vaccinated really early, December and January. And those people are now, 6 to 8 months out from their vaccinations. And with the Delta variant, they're seeing a lot of infections, more hospitalizations, a lot more breakthrough infections. And some of that is thought to be related to age, kind of blunting the immune response. And they've already started giving booster doses to people who are first over age 65 and now over age 50. And it seems to be decreasing the infection rates and hospitalization rates. So it is likely that at least in patients over 65, by the time you're about 8 months out, it may be worth considering a booster shot. What is not clear from the data I've seen yet is whether younger people with intact immune systems will need boosters, and if so, on what kind of timeline the science would support getting them. But politically, it sounds like, or from a regulatory standpoint, it sounds like the administration is going to be recommending booster shots for everyone by 8 months after vaccination. In terms of safety and side effects, there are a number of very robust mechanisms. Again, this is kind of unprecedented, the amount of surveillance that's being done to keep track of safety and side effects of these new vaccines. One is the vSafe registry, and that's one, it's voluntary. So anyone who gets a vaccine can submit any side effects or adverse events that they believe that they had that were related to the vaccine. There's the VAERS system, which is one that is clinically driven. So hospitals, people who administer the vaccines are following up and reporting any side effects or adverse events that they see. And then there's this very large database of just under 1 million patients that has 9 participating large hospital sites where they're following their own patients in high detail and comparing patients who have been and who have not been vaccinated to look for any signals of increased rates of any kind of complication. What do we know about the side effects from these vaccines? The common ones you've probably all heard about usually occur within 24 to 48 hours, pain at the injection site, flu-like symptoms, headache, fatigue. They're a little more common with the mRNA vaccines, more common after the second shot, and slightly more common with Moderna than with Pfizer. As far as safety is concerned, there have been over 5 billion doses of COVID vaccines, the various vaccines given worldwide, and over 350 million doses have been given in the United States. So just the pure volume of exposure that's happened is massive, and it far eclipses anything that you would see in a controlled trial that you would normally use to get approval for a vaccine or a drug. So there's a massive amount of data available. As far as mRNA vaccines are concerned, the 2 things that have come out of this analysis are, one, a slightly increased rate of myocarditis, so about 3.5 cases per million doses of vaccine that were given. And the subpopulation that seems to be most vulnerable to this complication is men who are aged 18 to 29, and the rate in that population is 24 per million. It's definitely not nothing. Some of these people require hospitalization, but all of them have been treated and recovered. Anaphylaxis is one that we knew there was an early signal for, so that's a severe allergic reaction. And the rates of those with the mRNA vaccines are about 2.5 to 4.7 per million doses. So again, very rare, but they do occur. They can be severe, and it's really important that providers are aware. And this is why people need to be monitored for a period of time afterwards so that this can be treated. Anaphylaxis untreated can be deadly. When treated, it is manageable. Manageable to the extent that even people who have allergic reactions to the first dose are still recommended that they get a second dose with increased monitoring. For the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, following up on AstraZeneca, which may be related to the fact that they use the same adenovirus, they use different adenoviruses, but they both use adenovirus platforms. And in both of those types of vaccines, there have been shown to be an incidence of blood clots that are very atypical kinds of blood clots. A lot of them happening in veins in the brain. And again, the rate is very low. It's about 3 per million. The most vulnerable group is young women, 18 to 49, where the rate is about 8.8 per million. These are extremely rare events, but unlike the anaphylaxis and myocarditis with mRNA vaccines, some of these have been fatal. And with the Johnson & Johnson, I believe there were 4 fatalities associated with blood clots from this vaccine. The other thing that's come out of safety surveillance for Johnson & Johnson is Guillain-Barre Syndrome, which is a transient kind of weakness. It's a neurologic process that can proceed to essentially paralysis, weakening of the respiratory muscles, requiring hospitalization and ventilatory support. It is a transient occurrence. It can happen after, very rarely after some other vaccines. It can happen after infections. It's related to some people's immune response. And this is also generally very treatable, although again, when it happens, it's a big deal. And this is about 7.8 per million. And the population that's most vulnerable are men who are not age 5, age 50 to 64. I believe there's 1 death that's been reported associated with Guillain-Barre syndrome in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So I'm not ever going to, you're never going to hear me say that any medication or treatment or drug or even food for that matter is going to be completely benign. There have been adverse events. Most of them have been, the vast majority have been treatable, and they are extremely rare. And to give you a sense of the scale that we're talking about, because these are funny numbers to think about, what does 3.5 per million look like? But 3.5, 4, 5, or even 10 cases per million for those 10 people is a lot. If you're in the other 999,995, then you are okay. If you think about what we're dealing with COVID risks, in contrast, the case fatality rate for COVID in the United States is 1.7%. So that's 17,000 deaths per million infections. So we're comparing, 4 cases of myocarditis to 17,000 cases of death, just to give you a sense of the scale that we're thinking about this when we're recognizing, when we who are physicians or scientists, epidemiologists, are recommending vaccination, even in the face of these rare side effects. These are the comparisons that we're thinking about. Weekly hospitalizations right now, weekly hospitalizations with COVID are 42 per million. And it's 115 per million for non-Hispanic Blacks. So this is, again, your risk of getting infected with COVID and ending up in the hospital this week, if you're a non-Hispanic Black person, is 115 per million compared to, a total risk of, 3 or 4 or 5 per million for having one of those other effects. And then if you're concerned about long COVID, the incidence of long COVID defined as having significant symptoms from the infection that are lasting more than 12 weeks is about 137,000 cases of long COVID per million infections. Almost 14% of people are developing long COVID symptoms after being infected. So these numbers aren't the ones that are reported when we're hearing about hospitalizations and deaths. And this is a major burden. If you know anyone who's experienced this, it can be pretty devastating. Some other considerations: fertility, pregnancy, and breastfeeding. No evidence that the vaccines affect fertility in men or women, although COVID, at least transiently, does seem to reduce fertility in men. The virus, not the vaccine. Severe COVID complications are more common in pregnancy. Pregnant women can mount a strong immune response to the vaccine, so it is effective in pregnant women. And there's no evidence of increased pregnancy complications. And antibodies are present in breast milk and may provide some protection to newborns. Some people are concerned about fetal cells in the vaccines. I would just say that fetal cells, cell lines that were developed from fetuses in the 1970s and 80s were used in the development of the Adenovirus vaccines. They're not in the vaccines, but they were used in the development of the vaccines. They were not used in the development of the mRNA vaccines. So 9 months later. So this is what we had hoped. I gave a presentation back in April. Things were looking pretty good with vaccinations. We were on a trajectory where at that pace, we would have been at 90% vaccination of everyone who was eligible by mid-July. We were talking about herd immunity, which we thought which at the time was expected to occur somewhere around 70 to 80% vaccination. So thinking if we continue at this pace by summer, we could reach herd immunity. We can maybe actually get past this thing. There's still a question of, are we going to need booster shots at some point? Is your immunity going to wane a little bit with time? Might there be some variants that we have to deal with that are going to be a problem? And this is where we are. So the vaccination rates basically took a nearly plateaued right after that very optimistic talk, to the extent that if they do continue at the current rate, we're going to be well into 2022 before we get to 90% vaccination. And we've also been confronted with the Delta variant. And what the Delta variant means, it spreads, because it spreads so much more easily than earlier strains, it changes the definition of herd immunity. So instead of looking at 70 to 80% to achieve herd immunity, you would need well over 90% immunity in the population to be able to control a virus that spreads like the Delta variant. So at this point, really, herd immunity is kind of off the table. This virus is something that we're going to be dealing with probably for the future of humanity. We're already into the place of talking about booster shots, discussing waning immunity, and we've got the future variants. So this is something we have to learn to live with, and the best hope that we have is that it would fade into something like the common cold. And what's going to get us there is immunity in the population. So COVID's not going anywhere. Immunity is currently our only protection. It's the only thing that's going to keep us from continuing to have widespread mortality and morbidity associated with this virus. Right? We still don't have any really good and reliable treatments for severe COVID or long COVID, which is a topic of a whole nother discussion. But right now, all we've got is immune protection, and there are two routes to get to immune protection. You either get infected by the virus or you get the vaccine. And one or both of those things is going to happen because, again, the virus isn't going anywhere. So if it's not this year, it's going to be next year. It's going to be the year after that. So it's really a decision of how you want to develop your protection. And what the data is saying, that I believe has been very rigorously examined, is that the risks of COVID remain far higher than the risks of the vaccine. So let's talk. These are my little people.
So I have a couple of questions I see in the chat, Megan, and then I'm also going to allow participants to unmute themselves. so they can ask you questions directly. And so right now, y'all, we're just going to ask some questions specific to the presentation that you just heard, and then we'll go into another conversation as well. But we want to just specifically focus on the presentation questions around that. And so there is a question in the chat wondering how important is it to vaccinate children 11 years and younger? And then also, I know you talked about booster shots, but can you just one more time reiterate the importance of a booster shot, and then how soon should you think to get one after you've been fully vaccinated the first time?
Okay, so vaccinating children 11 years and younger with the Delta variant, it's definitely spreading amongst children. We're seeing more children being hospitalized with it, and that may just be a factor. That may just be because it's spreading more and children are out in the world more than they were early in the pandemic. We kept children home a lot more. So maybe that's part of why we weren't seeing, maybe that may be part of why we thought they were a little more protected. But Delta also seems to be worse for children in that they are actually developing COVID pneumonia that looks a lot more like adult severe COVID, which is something we didn't see much with the earlier variants. They were getting this delayed inflammatory syndrome, but they generally were not getting very sick with like pulmonary disease and the kinds of manifestations of COVID that we see in adults. And we are seeing that in children with the Delta variant. That said, the vast majority of children still do very well and have minimal to no symptoms. It comes back to that same issue that I just said, though. And when I think about my kids and what to do for them, they are either they're going to be exposed to some variant of this virus at some point. So when that happens, do I want them to have a primed immune system? Do I want to vaccinate them before that happens to try to give them a better chance of, being able to fend it off? And that's really the question you have to answer when considering vaccination of children. How much risk are you willing to tolerate? It's very, compared to adults, it's low risk, but it's not no risk. And, it's our kids. So it's a very individual decision. How important is it to get the booster shot? I think we talked about it a little bit. I think if you're immune compromised, it's probably very important to get it for two reasons. One, your response to the vaccine may not have been great the first time around, and two, you're going to be more vulnerable to the virus should you be infected. So I think for immune compromised people, it's very important, and probably sooner rather than later. And generally, the guideline right now seems to be about 8 months for getting a booster for the general population. The importance, I think, is probably going to be age related, but we just don't have a lot of data yet about how vulnerable younger people are going to be over time. It just hasn't been enough time hasn't passed. So maybe another 4 months and everybody needs a booster, but we're not quite there yet.
In that vein, there's another question, in terms of natural ways of building immunity. I mean, we're talking about, vaccine hesitancy, and so and I like how you said, like, priming our immune systems to fend off a virus. I think that was really wonderful way how you worded that. Are there, natural remedies that could be useful? Or if I don't want to try to put it as an either or, but what sort of what would you say are sort of more of the benefits of a vaccine, like in this regard, versus maybe some more natural sort of remedies?
I'm trying to think of an analogy. I think that there are definitely natural ways of fortifying oneself against infection. And there are things that you can avoid to try to not dampen your immune response, right? So like the healthier a lifestyle you're living in general, if you're not smoking and drinking excessively and, decreasing your exposures, eating healthier, I think all of those things are going to be important in dealing with any kind of infection. I think there are specific natural immune boosting I don't want to say products, plants, herbs, supplements that can be pretty powerful in helping people to heal more quickly. That none of them are going to have the kind of specific directed, potent protection that you get from a vaccine, right? I think in combination, it's important to consider all of these things. I mean, I was, especially during the surge when I was working in the hospital, taking, high doses of vitamin C and elderberry syrup and, other supplements. But when confronted with a virus like this, that causes so much damage, nothing's going to be as effective as an immune system that recognizes that virus and knows how to clear it from your body and how to destroy cells that have been badly infected by it. It's just a very specific response that you can't replicate with supplements in that way.
Thank you, Megan. Ayana, I see you raising your hand. Do you want to ask a more directed question to Dr. Kirksey?
Well, I was just saying yes when I raised my hand, but most people, I think, would not know about or avail themselves of powerful, herbs and things that build your immune system so that you wouldn't be as likely to get it. So that takes some specific, knowledge and commitment. But we don't. So can we really know that that's not effective? I mean, I just got my second Mrna shot after being on the fence for 6 months. And I guess I'm glad I got it. So would it not be as effective if I waited 6 months? And also, do I want this going into all my cells if I'm not really exposed to COVID? It sounds like pretty drastic that this is going changing all your cells.
So the way the vaccines work, they don't change your cells. It's two different things. They don't go into all of your cells. One, it's especially the mRNA vaccines, they're injected into the muscle and they're taken up primarily locally and spread to local lymph nodes where the immune cells collect, where the immune cells gather and communicate with each other and start doing things like producing antibodies and other epitopes that help them to recognize and to attack pathogens, right? And they gather pretty locally. That's why you may have seen that for mammograms, they recommended like delaying mammograms for a certain amount of time, a couple months, I think, after getting the vaccine, because they're lymph nodes in the axilla that are local to where the injection happens, where you get a robust inflammatory response, because that's where most of the material from the vaccine comes into contact with the immune cells. It's not like this mRNA is being, distributed throughout all of the cells of your body and altering those cells. It's being picked up by, it's the same, similar to when you actually get exposed to a pathogen. It doesn't need to go to all of the cells of your body for you to create an immune response to it. It just needs to get into enough cells that your body can recognize it and mount a response and communicate with the rest of your immune system. And then the mRNA doesn't integrate into the DNA or the RNA in the cell. It's degraded quite quickly in the body, so it's not altering, but it is injecting something into your body that wasn't made by your body, and that didn't grow naturally. So I'm not dismissing the concern at all about, the fact that it feels that people have very strong feelings about injecting something that was made in a lab into their body. That's how all vaccines are made. If someone does not feel comfortable with vaccines in general, that's a pretty high hurdle to overcome to make this vaccine seem feel any different, and that.
Well, I was going to say, Doctor, if not to interrupt you, I apologize to do that, but it just popped in my brain the thought though that I think for a lot of people that also is like the crux of the concern, about the ways in which these things are being manufactured, the institutions that are responsible for them. How is it that we as citizens, we as people trying to be informed, also trying to be healthy, trying to be smart and rational, making these decisions with understanding entities and interests and all other types of things that kind of go into that. And so how do we sort of talk to people where their concern is more about the institutions that are behind the creation of these vaccines, the way in which the CDC and the information changes regularly. I understand, for me personally, like that's just science. When you get new data, the information changes, but for a lot of people that's disconcerting. So how do we sort of maybe even speak to that that part of the concern that's sort of driving the hesitancy?
Right. That's a lot of different things. I can start at the end of that. You may have to refresh some of the earlier things that you brought up. But yes, science is it's iterative, right? So you're collecting data and you're making hypotheses and you're collecting more data and then at the same time things are changing in the background, right? So in the beginning, we had no data about the virus. We had some understanding of the vaccines that made us feel like like they were most likely quite safe. They were studied in a small, what now seems like a vanishingly small population, but what's standard for testing a drug or a vaccine, about 70,000 people. And they looked safe and effective. And we had this virus that was killing a lot of people. And then we find out more as we go along, because the decision was made that this virus is so dangerous that this level of protection needs to be made available to the population. And we will continue to watch very closely for any adverse effects that would be concerning. And as those have arisen, as millions and millions and then billions of doses of these vaccines have been given, these very rare side effects that you'll never see in a clinical trial, they're being picked up, and people are looking deeply into them and trying to understand how to manage them, who might be at highest risk for them, how to avoid them. But there's no, I find it hard to fathom that in this context, especially with different groups, different organizations, different governments, different companies, all surveilling different public health or agencies, that there would be any kind of high risk complication that could be buried, from the public discourse, anything that would come anywhere near the amount of risk that the actual virus is presenting. I can't say that that someone hasn't had a bad effect that wasn't reported, and the companies definitely have their own motivations for doing things. Like when we talk about booster shots, all of the vaccine companies are testing their own vaccines as boosters, right? I mean, they're incentivized to boost with their own vaccine. Pfizer's not going to say, like, invest a lot of money in saying, will people do better if they get Mrna or Novavax as their booster instead, right? That's not going to happen. But governments are looking at that, right? Like public health institutions are looking at that. There's a lag, right? So there are studies that are happening in the UK and elsewhere where they have very robust public health systems, where they're able to look at these things, and they're very systematically starting to look at combinations of vaccines for booster efficacy. But yeah, it's not like the corporations don't have any internal motivation to be successful themselves. But I think
It is like a catch-22. It's like a catch-22, because if it was free, then we'd really be raising an eyebrow, like, okay, you know, they're like, we ain't got no interest. It's like, wait, hold up, you know. But then there is, yeah. This is great. I want to just tag for time, everyone. So just so you know, we're only going to go to about 8 o'clock. So we're just going to take just a couple of more questions before we wrap. But I have one question in the chat I definitely want to get to, but for those who haven't spoken yet, I'd love to get a chance to hear from you. I have a question in the chat. One is asking about a conversation they've had with a family member, sort of the debate, if you will, between this being personal decision versus a communal decision. I don't want to say a political decision, but a communal decision. What sorts of suggestions would you sort of offer people in trying to either negotiate that challenge or to try to communicate with others around that challenge? Because I think that's also a big part of the hesitancy too, doctor, is, you know, what people feel is best for them versus doing what is best for me in relationship to others. How would you sort of help us sort of navigate that?
I'm going to kick that one back to you, Pastor Darrow.
Back to me?
A lot of talking. This is a moral responsibility question.
It's a moral. Oh Lord, oh Lord. Okay, let me take this call out. But well, okay. Well, I'll see if I can tackle it. But and say though, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to go about it. Honestly, I think the most important thing that we can do in a moment such as this, the overall arching moment, but especially in those types of conversations, is to listen. I think that's the most important thing we can do. I will say for myself, one of the reasons why I wanted to host this space too is because, you know, even as a pastor, as a person of faith, as a leader in this community, I was hesitant about getting this vaccine. I'm just going to just testify if I could today. Mm-hmm. And I'm hesitant along the lines of personal and communal, just to be really honest, you know. And so how do I make decisions that I feel are ethical for the larger community, but also responsible for just how I choose to live and function in a day-to-day? And I felt that one of the challenges too is that how do we listen to each other in the fears and the trepidations that might be being voiced sort of underneath the surface, that people might not necessarily have all the words to specify what their fears and their trepidations are, if that makes sense. So I think one of the most important ways to handle that is to listen. It's not a medical answer, but definitely from a moral perspective, I think it can help us. Did you want to, I'm gonna just sort of ping pong it to you, Megan, see if there was another thought that might come up in your mind, but then turn it over to someone else. But is there anything you'd like to add to follow up to that?
Well, I just saw Anna, I think, raise her hand again, and I think there's someone else. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna, let's move.
So what Reverend Darrow was saying, you know, I think it's important to listen to people and not to browbeat people. Like hesitancy is like some kind of disease or something, you know, or not to keep, you know, to listen that people have their valid reasons for doing what they do. So I think that's important.
Thank you.
And for personally, you know, if you wait 6 months between the two vaccinations, does that lower the effect of it?
You mean between the 2 shots of an mRNA vaccine?
Right.
It might. What it's definitely going to do is leave you much more vulnerable in that 6-month window.
Well, I was fine.
Pardon?
I was fine.
I mean, leave one, not you specifically, but you know, there's a good amount of data about this, especially as it relates to the Delta variant, and the protection that the mRNA vaccines provide against hospitalization and severe disease are much, much lower in people who've only had 1 shot. those high levels of protection that I described that still exist for severe disease and hospitalization, et cetera, those are for people who've received 2 shots of the vaccine. So if you're thinking about, so when you're thinking about the timing, I would just say don't assume that you have the protection of a full vaccination in that window if you're going to stretch the window out. Whether at 6 months when you get the second shot, you will have the same degree of protection. We just don't have the data. You may well be able to stretch it out that much. I know in the UK, the reason that they can tell you that difference between 1 shot and 2 shots is because they went the route of trying to get as many people 1 shot as possible before giving a second shot. So they have more people who were spaced out. And you can definitely looks like you can go a few months and still get good protection. 6 months, I'm not sure.
Okay, so I'll just go back to my former point, you know, to really listen and respect people and not, yeah, not to browbeat people.
I'm sorry, that felt like browbeating.
Even the church, you know, doesn't have to just push one point of view and not listen to anything else.
That's great, Ayana. Thank you for that, Ayana. I want to just create space. Is there any other person that might have a question? I know we have tons of questions, but I know we went a little long on time. But if there's one other question to kind of wrap us up with, would love to create space for that for those who might not have articulated anything. Yes, you can feel free to unmute yourself.
Right. It's not a question, it's a response to a question that was just put in the chat. It's on the same, we're building on the same issue of how to talk to someone who you're trying to help move to a place of you know, an affirming decision about the vaccination. And so the person was saying, well, it's great to listen, but how do you start a conversation? Yeah. And just from the context of the work that I do in terms of conflict resolution and anti-racist training and so forth, there is a form, it's a format, if you like, or a formula that we ask people to use when they're trying to interrupt, for example, racism or interrupt, so forth. And I think it could be applicable here, is to ask the person, talk to me, tell me, what is it, how is it that you came to this decision? What things happened, or however you can frame this thing of, you know, depending on what the person is saying, what's happened in your life, what has been your experience that brought you to this? And be really interested in hearing, and that's where the listening thing comes in. And then if you want to share it with them, thank you so much for sharing with me. For me, the things that happen in my life to bring me to my decision, and don't be saying it in a way of, and this is better than what brought you to yours. It just is what brought me to mine. And then leave it. Mm-hmm. And then leave it. You don't have to try to solve it or anything, but being genuinely there to listen to that person, and then genuinely offering your experience that brought you to your decision. And then you bless it for both of you, and hope for the best if that can help.
Thank you.
The person, you know.
Thank you very much.
That was perfect. I think that's a perfect way to end this. May I call you Reverend Powell? Can I do that?
Well, my father always said that my ministry, my anti-racism work, my activism is my ministry. So that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Amen. But no, I think that's right there. And so we will end our conversation here because it's right a little 5 after 8. But what I would like to invite people to do, though, Megan, if it's okay with you, your email was shared out in the email announcements ahead of today. If there are questions that you still have that you would like to get answered, please feel free to email myself and Megan, or just Megan or me. But we definitely want people to have an opportunity to have your questions answered or addressed in some way. And so we might not have gotten a chance to get to it all tonight, but you can definitely reach out to us so we can continue in this dialogue. So I think it is one that's really important. And my mom is the one who wrote in the chat, is there room to talk about the communal aspects some more? And so Mama, I'm due for a call. So I guess I'll call you and we can talk about that at that time. But thank you all so much for your attention. Dr. Kurtzky, thank you so much for your expertise and your time. I hope that this was a helpful space to hold for all of us here. And again, if you have any outstanding questions, you can feel free to reach out to us, and we will intend to create more spaces like these in the future. And so thank you all so much for coming and giving us of your time. Dr. Kurtzky, you want to give a final parting word?
Ooh. Yeah, I thank you all for listening and giving me some time to share information. I said at the very beginning, my goal is only to share as much information as possible from my understanding of science and medicine so that people can make informed decisions for themselves. And, I definitely understand hesitancy. If we had more time, I would tell you about my own experiences with hesitancy around the vaccine for me and for my children, and how I came around to my decisions for myself. And, I'm coming around to them for the children. I think these are very complicated and nuanced issues, and everyone's coming from a different perspective. But if you have any interest in, the data, which is that's what I tie myself to. I'm a very data-driven person. And, I have a pretty good understanding of the data around this virus and this vaccine. So any questions related to that, I'm very happy to field at any time. I spend way too much time reading about it.
Well, thank you, everyone. Blessings on your evening. And we will hold a space like this again soon. And so thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Blessed night. Good night.
Yes, good night, everybody.
Take care. Be
Blessings.
well.
Thank you.